Let me start by asking a very common one. A lot of people have asked us that there seems to be many possible difficulties. So, how to distinguish which difficulty is important and which one will fix itself?
Uh, this actually it depends on where the child's age and what is appropriate for that age. So, for example, if I give an example, many people talk about reversals of letters and numbers when it comes to that's one of the very commonly reported academic difficulty. If it is a child in the preschool age, reversal is very common even among children who are, this is a typical normal development. So
Right,
we need not be alarmed at that stage.
right,
But if it persists even after 6 to 7 years of age, if the reversals still continue to persist, then of course we need to be alarmed. So many of the difficulties, it depends, it has to be actually seen through what is appropriate for children of that age. So one good common sense indicator would be if most of the children in the classroom or most children of that age are able to achieve those things at that age, and this child is struggling, that's when it's a you can say, okay, there's a red flag indicator. But again, as I said, once there is that red flag indicator, try different strategies, try different activities, try different methods of teaching. And if it still doesn't seem to be helping the child in a big way and the child is continuing to struggle or not showing as much progress and not coming almost, if not on par, at least almost on par with other children in the classroom, then definitely you need to refer the child.
great. Sure. I hope that answer will help our attendees. So another question that we have is from Mr. Lokesh. We have received a lot of pandemic related questions. So Mr. Lokesh is
Yeah.
asking how to create curiosity regarding studies among children in this pandemic situation, as physically the child is not attending the school.
Yes, actually, it is a lot of good educators are doing very good online sessions. They actually try to create an interest by showing an animation or a video, or start with a song, etc. Especially in the preschool levels and early education levels, I find a lot of teachers actually doing these things to catch the attention of the children, which is very good. Uh, Another, if for the older classes, I would suggest that is where a little bit, things become more formal and formal teaching goes on. So to increase or to get the children motivated in the lessons, one of the things I do is have a group discussion or probably give the topic ahead of time and ask the children to go online and research or get some information about it, so that that can form a basis for the start of the class. So doing things like this actually will help to bring out the curiosity, and the main thing is engage the student actively. So just because it's online, let it not be a passive learning platform. Even in the regular classes, passive learning doesn't help much. There need to be active involvement of the students. So even online, if you can do this, that will be good. And using audiovisual medium, you can even have things like games, etc. Nowadays, online, a lot of educational games are available. So
Right.
try and find activities, games, or these kind of things which relate to the concept that you're going to teach. So when you do that, you can actually engage the learner more actively, and that will give you better results.
Sure. Sure. Okay, I have another interesting question from Elizabeth. She is attending the webinar live with us. She is asking how are behavioral consequences different from the functional ones, if there is a difference at all between them.
It's not really very different, because it's ultimately the behavioral ones that result into the functional consequences. So it's not
Okay.
very different, but it is, when you talk about, they are very much overlapped.
Right.
It is more for us as educators. It's more of a technical differentiation, rather than in the classroom. It's very difficult to say, okay, this part is behavioral and this part is functional. They are very much intertwined. It's just so that we can pick out and understand easily that we call it as behavioral and functional. If the behaviors persist for a long time, it will result in functional consequences.
Great. Okay. I think so. I hope that answers your question, Elizabeth. I have another very interesting question, and a couple of people have asked this. And since you have spent years in inclusive education, I would personally like to ask you this. How can the term inclusive education be interpreted when the differently abled students need a different pedagogy for learning and acquiring skills?
Yeah, this is a very, very big term. Um, when we talk about inclusive education, most people think it's the first thing they think of is, okay, putting all these children into the regular mainstream education. Inclusive education in the right sense should be very long term. We have to view it as a long term goal. So not all children, although according to the Right to Education Act and the recently introduced, I think in 2016, the Right to Persons with Disabilities Act have all talked about inclusive education. Yet we have to see what is best for the child. Now, some children are ready for inclusion with support systems right from the word go. Even from preschool itself, they are okay with it. Whereas with certain students, depending on their needs and challenges that they face, they may not be ready for mainstream education. Or they may be ready for mainstream education, but they would need the services of, say, a shadow teacher all the time within the regular classroom. So it depends on child to child what is appropriate and depending on their strengths and again the challenges they face. Also, just because some children actually go through mainstream schooling in the early part, and they manage well with the support systems or the resource room facility and so on. But then when they come to a certain point, say middle school or high school, once the curriculum becomes much more demanding, many of these children find it very difficult to continue in the mainstream, even with resource room support or whatever accommodations the CBSE board is giving, they may still find it difficult to cope. So in those cases, we might have to think of rethink their placement. And this is why I said when I talked about early identification and appropriate placement, for every child, regular mainstream may not be the only answer. And it may vary for the same child also, it may vary at different points of time in their life. So, there are children, we have seen children who may have, say, for example, autism spectrum, who fall onto the autism spectrum disorders. Some of these children, we find that in the early stages, they are not ready for regular school. But with therapies, interventions, and support systems, maybe at say by grade 1 or grade 2, they're ready to be included. With again, of course, with support systems. Whereas there are other children, like for example, if you look at some of the severe children with learning disabilities, they find it difficult sometimes when it comes to high school. So even though the boards offer provisions of, say, scribe or interpreter or subject drop option and extra time, etc., they still may not be able to get through. So in those cases, they may have to look for other options like open schooling or probably shift to learning centers which offer special schools which offer open schooling as an alternative. Here, why there might be, I mean, I'm not being politically correct here when I say they have to be taken out. Our intention is to keep them mainstreamed as much as possible and for every child to get the benefits of mainstream education. But we have to also look in terms of what is best for the child in the long term, because schooling is just only one part of life. So if by remaining in the regular school, say for example, if it's a child with severe learning disabilities, and you persist with the regular board system, even though the child is not coping, and what will happen is the child will probably meet with failure. So then that puts an end to their academic achievements and their ability to go on. I mean, like in our organization itself, we have had a lot of children who have come from regular streams such as CBSE or the state board metrics schemes.
Right.
And they've gone through open schooling and they've completed their +2 and managed to get into colleges or professional courses. And now they are successful, have been placed in jobs. So they have been included in community now because they've found good jobs, they've found comfortable careers, and they have become successful in life. So that is where we should view inclusion, as a long-term goal. So it shouldn't be just narrowed down into just inclusive education in regular schools as such. Inclusivity is a much broader concept than being restricted to just schooling. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was a brilliant answer indeed. It answered my question as well. Thank you so much. Okay, another question from Kavita Shah. She's asking, what is the appropriate age for sending a child for learning disability assessment? What are some of the tools to identify special need child or children with learning disability?
With regard to learning disability, actually the currently used definition, the technical definition is what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of USA, the 5th edition, that is DSM-5 as it's called, says. And according to the DSM-5, LD is not really diagnosed very early. Normally, children are referred to us because they have academic difficulties or, as I said, related skill difficulties. And usually what is done is, instead of going for a diagnostic assessment, what is preferred is to go for a psychoeducational assessment. Rather than giving a diagnostic label at that stage, especially if the child has not had any intervention or support systems prior to that, go for a psychoeducational assessment to give us information about what to do for the child's intervention or for remedial education. So go for a psychoeducational assessment, which will provide us information for what are the best intervention services that can be provided. Give those supportive systems and see how the child is responding. And that is called the response to intervention. And that is another key feature that has been added on with the DSM-5. That is, you have to give the child at least 6 months with intensive intervention as per the child's needs, and see whether the child is progressing and getting on par with the expectations of the curriculum and what is expected at that grade level. If the child is still struggling, then the response to intervention will actually throw up. But again, in the response to intervention, they talk about tiers also. Different tiers are there. The first tier is you provide minimal support, and then there are different levels of support that are provided. So there are 3 levels of support given. Even after the third level of the third level is the most intensive support. First being the least, the third being the most. Even after that, if the child is having trouble and still facing difficulties and is struggling, then definitely they are sent for a more multidisciplinary formal assessment. Again, as I said, a diagnostic label is not what is important. What is important is what services are provided to the child. Diagnostic label, according to me, is most necessary when we have to apply for boards, especially for the board exams, when we have to apply for concessions, allowances, accommodations that is provided by the board for exams and so on. That is when because the boards insist on a diagnosis. So then you have to go for a diagnostic assessment. Otherwise, what I would say is, especially with learning disabilities, it's very difficult to categorize learning disabilities in contrast to other disability conditions, because it is very not so obvious. It's more of a hidden kind of disorder, because most of these children will be functionally very okay in most of the respects of life. But when it comes to academic and related issues, that's when they have problems. So it is best to follow not a diagnostic model, but to follow a more of a response to intervention model. So that, I think, you don't really have to go into a diagnostic label unless it's necessary. And usually it is done like when they are going to appear, when they have to apply for concessions to the board.
Sure, sure. Okay, I have a similar and related question. Imelda, who is watching our webinar live from Facebook, is asking us, what is the age of a child that can be considered ideal to start with these early interventions? You were just talking about interventions, so if you could throw some light on this.
We say right from birth. If you know there is a risk right at birth, because some of the what later manifests as academic difficulties may be due to also certain developmental disorders. So some of them, just as certain disorders which are present at birth and can be identified at birth. Right from then, they may be an established disability, or they may be just some risk factors. Sometimes, even with the neonatal newborns, there's something called an APGAR score that is done for all neonates. And if the APGAR score is not normal, then there is a risk factor. So to monitor the child right from then onwards. And it depends on, again, as I said, it depends on child to child. For example, learning disabilities is usually not very evident until they start formal schooling. Or although a lot of children with learning disabilities, if you go into their history, many of the parents do report that they were normal, they had normal development in all areas, but speech and language was delayed, or maybe attention, the child was very over or hyperactive. So some of these were indications in the early stages, even before formal schooling started. But with learning disabilities, because the other areas are, pretty typical developing areas, it gets overlooked, and, then it actually hits them when they start formal schooling. But with a lot of the other developmental disorders, when with the developmental milestones itself, whether it's a social area, whether it's a speech and language area, motor milestone area, in all these areas, if there is significant delay, that is easily identifiable. And as I said, some genetic disorders, or early even congenital disorders which are present at the time of birth. Down syndrome is a thing which is at birth they can recognize, and the moment the child has Down syndrome, they go in for genetic karyotyping and all that, and confirm the diagnosis. Then right from then, there is a risk factor, so you can start early infant stimulation. We don't call it intervention at that point. It is stimulation, so that a delay doesn't set in. You're trying to arrest the delay that may set in later on, or to minimize the delays.
Sure. Okay. I have another question from Madhvi Verma. She's asking, how can we deal with students who have reached class 5th and they still fail to recognize alphabets? For our attendees from other countries, I would like to explain that class 5th would mean that the child is 10 years old. So, and they're still unable to recognize alphabets and are therefore unable to read and write. So Madhvi is asking, how can we help these students?
Well, you have to start. You've already mentioned in the difficulty the child has, that the child has trouble with recognizing alphabets. So you have to start right from there itself. Probably explore more ways of how the child can be taught to recognize alphabets. Probably the child is being taught in the traditional paper pencil method, which may not be working. So you have to try, kinesthetic, or learning through movement, learning through activities, use multisensorial approaches, and use audiovisual mediums as well. So all these put together, the child will hopefully learn to read at some point of time. Some of the children, having said that, if they have, severe dyslexia or those kind of issues, they may learn some bit of reading, but with intervention and with the right kind of remedial support, but they may still remain struggling readers all their life. So for such children, we may have to use technological support. So nowadays, you have things like text to speech software, etc., which is available, or audio of e-textbooks, etc., available. So you can use these kind of things to circumvent their reading problems, so that studying is not hampered or obstructed because of a reading struggle.
Right. Hope that answers your question, Madhvi. Okay, so today we have a wide variety of attendees. There are teachers, there are parents, there are school administrators who are attending our webinar. So I'm trying to pick questions from each of these categories. So one of the teachers by the name of Anita Pandey is asking us what can be the different classroom strategies which we can use to teach children, especially the children who have learning difficulties.
Classroom strategies, if I may say so, three main areas you have to target. One is classroom management, that is the behavioral aspect, how you can bring about, more positive behaviors in the classroom. So second thing is, how you're adapting your curriculum, all the curriculum, what the materials that you're using, the teaching methodologies and strategies you're using. The third would be if you need to bring about changes within the physical infrastructure, the way your classroom setting is. So three broad areas. And this is not just for children with disabilities. In fact, because we have more and more diversities in the classrooms nowadays, with most schools becoming, whether they accept it or not, there are still diversities within the regular classrooms. So whether you have a child with an established disability or not, this is good for all children, regardless of whether you have children with special needs. You have to take care of classroom. When we talk about classroom arrangement, seating, you can think about different ways of seating. Instead of the normal rows that we encounter in most of our schools, think of different kinds of seating arrangement, like making more smaller groups with different kind of furniture. You can even think of variety of seating arrangements. You can have desks and tables at one end, but also have, say, a floor seating in a corner, say for reading or storytelling or those kind of things. So having different kinds of seating arrangements help. Different kinds of seats also help, especially children who are very active. Children with hyperactivity, attention issues, they have a tendency to move around, or they need to. They're pretty restless in the stiff seats that we normally provide within the classroom. So nowadays, there are certain wiggly, squiggly seats which can be put on top of the chairs, and they can sit on this. This will wiggle and squiggle, so they get that necessary movement, which helps them to focus better. So these kind of different seating can be explored. The other thing is classroom management. Think of behavioral strategies, giving points, using of behavior charts, etc., to promote more positive learning behavior, or to encourage, to give stars, points, and these kind of things. Also, use the same behavior chart to reduce points, which is called response cost. Reduce the points if they are showing inappropriate behavior or not, doing what is required of them. So use a behavior chart kind of thing. Different ways of creative ways are available. So use a behavior management system which will promote more positive behavior and reduce more negative behavior. The third and the most important construct is how to modify your teaching. So bring about more multisensory teaching. So whatever concept you're teaching, use visual, auditory, movement or kinesthetic, and touch or tactile learning. So whatever concept you're teaching, try teaching them in all these different kind of activities, because there are diverse learners who use diverse modalities to learn. They may have diverse learning styles. So bring in multisensory activities to cater to all the diverse learners. So even if they are not able to learn through one activity, maybe the other activity will still help them learn. So multisensory learning is another thing. The third one of the most important thing is something called differentiated instruction. Differentiated instruction is when within a classroom, you can kind of do the same, you can either modify the curriculum content and reduce it for the children who are having challenges. So for example, if you're teaching a lesson on animals, say you're teaching animals, mammals, birds, amphibians, and all that. But maybe for the child who has challenges and is not ready to take in so much information, you would probably just ask them to learn the different categories and examples of the animals. Name some of the animals in that category. Whereas for the other children who are more able, you might give more information on each of those categories. So you can modify the content of the curriculum that you give when you're doing differentiation. You can also modify the way you present the matter. So as I said, use multisensorial ways. You can also modify the product, that is how the children are going to do the task. For example, if you're giving a worksheet or you're setting an exercise for the children to do, you can modify the difficulty level of the worksheet in such a way that the ones with challenges are given the same content but with simpler worksheet. So for example, if a child is having a lot of reading and writing issues or spelling issues, you won't expect the child to write big sentences on animals. Okay, you will provide the sentences and the keywords, and probably they just have to match it with the pictures. The same worksheet, the same content can be given to a higher level child, where you don't have to necessarily give the keywords. The child can just give the picture clues and they will be able to write it by themselves. So depending on the children, you have to learn, you have to do a differentiated instruction within the classroom. So some of these things, if you take into account, I think, the three areas, classroom behavior management, the classroom physical settings, and the curriculum and instructional adaptations, you should be able to reach out to all kinds of learners in the classroom.
Sure. Interesting. That was a fantastic answer, Geeta ji. I hope most of the teachers present here in our audience today would benefit from the set of advices that you gave. And like I said, we have a whole wide variety of attendees attending the webinar today. So one of the questions from the school administrator, from one of the school administrators is, mostly schools do this thing where they divide the top performers and, students with lesser grades into different sections, like putting the top performers in section A and putting students with less grades in section D. So this administrator wants to understand if that helps the child with learning difficulties or it has a negative impact on their performance.
I'll speak from my experience. I have worked in schools where both this has been done. And then later on, we found that, I don't know, personally speaking, I'm not an advocate of that. When I talked about differentiated instruction, where you modify, I just recently explained, what a lot of schools do is they do this. They divide the children, into sections where one section is the high performers or the above level children, below level children, on level children, and so on. I personally prefer if there is mixed ability classes. And the reason being, a lot of times within the same classroom, when you have the three levels, the children actually get good peer models to emulate. So a child who is at the below level does not have to remain in the below level all the time. They have good models in front of them that they can see and they can aspire to become. The second thing is, one of the strategies we also use in inclusive settings is using peer group, peer tutoring or peer buddies to help children who have difficulties. So it helps both ways. When you use peer group, peer buddies, the more able child gets to teach the other children, which means they are learning it better themselves, because when you teach, you learn it more yourself. Also, it helps the other children. They feel less intimidated because their peer group is teaching them. So, that really helps, and it helps develop a healthy emotional and social connect between all the children in the classroom. And besides, just because the child is below level in one area, it doesn't mean they will be below level in all areas. Some children may be low in the language area, but they may be high in the math area. So, again, that becomes a problem. So if you, it doesn't have to be that, you have to, they may not be uniformly low in all areas. Different children are different. They come with so many different permutations and combinations into the classroom. So I personally prefer mixed ability grouping. And even within the mixed ability, I have actually worked in classrooms where we have done mixed ability grouping. So what we do is and even that grouping is not, it doesn't stay as rigid as stone. Whenever you find the child, say from the below level group is picking up, they can be moved within the groups. They can move into the higher groups, and move on. And sometimes a child who started off the year probably being in the higher group is just not picking up, or is and so they may be moved into the group where the more challenges or children more challenging children are placed. So the grouping is very fluid, and that works because within a classroom the teacher has the power to do that. And it helps because, again, as I said, they find good models when you mainstream them, when you streamline them according to all different sections. What happens is, quite often the below level groups, you find that they don't have good models in their own classroom, because most of the children are the ones with difficulties.
Right.
So they don't have some good role model to emulate.
Right.
That is a very key factor also. And generally I have found through experience that those classes, they never rise up. So when you have mixed ability, you have a much greater chances of children trying to catch up and wanting to be. In fact, I've had a lot of children who have been and it depends on the ability. See, for example, if they are low, say in language area, they may be better in math area. Sometimes they may be low in both, but they may be good in art. So when you're doing an art lesson, you can have these children come up and the so-called academically bright student may not be a good artist, whereas the other child may be a good artist. So you can make use of those abilities. And when you're incorporating art and all these kind of things into multisensorial learning, those children can become good advocate, can actually present your concept using their stronger area of talent or skill. So I find mixed ability grouping is far better.
Sure. I hope that answers questions of our audience. We are running short of time, so I'll be picking the last two questions. I'm trying and asking questions which are more common, which most of the people have asked. And one such question is, there seems to be some basic issues, which are identified quite late. For example, issues related to reading or writing, which are identified when the kid is a lot more older. So what is a good way to approach this problem, and what is a good way to deal with this issue?
Actually, it is not identified at that stage. I would like to say, yes, we do have a lot of children who come to us, say in middle school or high school, and that is when the reading has been noticed. But actually, if you talk to the parents, you will find out that the children did have difficulties even in the younger classes. But because the curriculum expectations and the difficulty level of the curriculum was very, much minimal at that stage, it was not noticed. Or somehow, especially if the children are very smart, very bright, or with very high IQ students, they somehow manage to mask their difficulties and move on. But then there comes a point when the curriculum gets really tough, and that's when these difficulties surface. So it doesn't mean that they don't have difficulties. It would have been there, but it might have gone unnoticed, and therefore not paid attention to. Also, the thing is, I don't know how much we are actually in our schools focusing on teaching reading. Nowadays, with a lot of the curriculum content having been increased a lot, uh, schools, teachers, administrators are all in a rush to cover portions as much as possible, cover the syllabus, rather than working on the actual skills. So so covering 20 chapters or whatever is there in the textbook seems to be the goal, not necessarily covering the skills. If you actually work at covering the skills and not so much on what you can even teach 10 chapters out of the 20 and still cover all the skills required. So I think what needs to be looked into is whether the skills are being covered. If not, then focus on teaching those skills. If the skills are not being covered, that is when, these children go through schooling, and reach, say, middle school or high school, and then their reading or writing problems surface. And also how much we are actually looking into experiential learning. We tend to have a lot of rote memorization of material and just reproducing it in exams or assessments, without looking at whether the child actually has the language capability of expressing thoughts and ideas in their own words, etc. So again, as I said, when it is a smaller, the younger classes, the material is very less. So they manage to memorize it and reproduce it. Where as they grow older, it becomes more and more difficult, and therefore they are unable to do it. So looking at skills is skill-based learning should be the focus. It is because that is not done, it is not noticed at the earlier stages.
Sure. I hope that helps the parents and the special educators who are present with us here in the audience. I'll take one last question, and that is if you could, actually, it is a request from many of the participants, if you could elaborate more on the topic of our webinar in regards to current ways of learning, that is online learning. It would be really helpful for the participants.
Yeah. With online learning, we find we've had mixed experiences actually. Certain children seem to respond very well to online learning, in fact, better. Especially children who who are on the autism spectrum. Actually, we were more concerned about children who had autism spectrum disorders, thinking how would they actually benefit from this kind of a learning, because many of us know they have poor eye contact, poor social communications.
There seems to be some technical glitch. Hope Geeta ji will join us soon in a minute. And even if she doesn't, dear audience, let me inform you all that we have covered most of the questions that you have asked us today, and the remaining ones we'll definitely try and cover.
Because they always had. Hello?
Hello?
Is it okay now? Am I back?
Yeah. I would request you to repeat the last few lines. We couldn't hear you.
Yeah. Okay. See, for example, when it comes to autism spectrum disorders, they do have trouble with face-to-face interaction, and with these children, we have found that online learning has been a boon. They seem to be responding well to that. Whereas with other children, certain other children, it hasn't been. So it depends on child to child. Sometimes what we request is ask the parent to be beside the child or a sibling to be beside the child to help out when the online class is going on. Another thing what we've done is, send the material beforehand so that, the child is at least has a familiarity with the content that is going to be covered. Also, as use things like videos, games, or something to introduce the child beforehand to the topic, so that when the class is actually going on, there is some understanding, and it helps a child have a reference point from where to access the teaching that is going on. It is this, again, we are all new in this, not just the children, even the educators. So we are also learning as it goes along. But from our little experience and the few months that we have done, this is what we have found. Like some children have difficulties, whereas some have actually responded better through online learning. In fact, some of them even prefer. Some of our older children with autism spectrum who are on the autism spectrum are actually telling us, no, continue learning, continue teaching us in this way. So, they seem to find screen-based learning much less threatening than face-to-face interaction.